The global economy moves to the beat of trade. It's simple yet essential. Goods from all over the world are constantly in motion. Coffee beans from Brazil, semiconductors from South Korea, shoes from Vietnam, smartphones from China, car parts from Germany, wheat from Canada, and the occasional rubber duck. These items fuel the world's economy, and their movement across oceans, railways, and borders makes the world go round. Now, picture this. It's a Wednesday morning, and one country decides, out of the blue, to slap a heavy and miscalculated tariff on every other country in the world. Sound outlandish? Well, it's not, thanks to Donald Trump and his administration. As the world knows all too well by now, the former president ignited a global trade firestorm by imposing significant tariffs on nearly every trading partner, but none more so than China. Back in 2018, Trump imposed Section 301 tariffs on China, but in 2025 he escalated the conflict further, imposing a staggering 125% tariff on all Chinese imports, which was later hiked to 145% on April 10th. But in an unexpected twist, on April 9th, 2025, Trump announced a dramatic pause to the retaliatory tariffs for all countries, except China. This move effectively kept a 10% baseline tariff for everyone else, while hiking China's tariff to 145%. The result? The stock market exploded, with the S&P 500 soaring 9.5%, its biggest daily gain since 2008. So, the question now is this. Is Trump playing 3D chess to isolate China and push for a global trade negotiation, or was this simply a knee-jerk reaction to plunging stock and bond markets? The truth? We're still not sure. While trade relations with other countries seem to have slightly improved, the fog of uncertainty still looms large. We're left wondering what his next move will be. Unfortunately, this may just be the beginning of something much larger, unless a dose of reason and logic finally emerges from both the US and Chinese administrations. Let's break it down and examine the facts, using real, reliable data, rather than the made-up numbers initially peddled by the Trump administration. Then, we'll take it from there. Average tariffs between the US and its top trading partners. 2024 US tariffs. Pre-2025, the average US tariff rates were relatively low thanks to free trade agreements like USMCA, CORUS, and AUSFTA. On average, US tariffs range between 1.6% to 2.5%, World Bank 2020, adjusted for Section 301 tariffs on China. Specifically, China bore the brunt of these tariffs, with a hefty 19.3%, accounting for Section 301 duties imposed from 2018 to 2024. April 2025 U.S. tariffs. 10% baseline. Starting April 5th, 2025, Trump imposed a 10% tariff baseline on all imports through an executive order. This set the stage for sweeping changes in global trade. China. The tariff on China's imports escalated sharply to 145% on April 10th, 2025, up from previous levels of 54%, 104%, and 125%. Reciprocal tariffs. On April 9th, 2025, the U.S. announced a 90-day pause on retaliatory tariffs for countries other than China. Canada and Mexico. For both Canada and Mexico, the 10% baseline tariff remained in place. However, the 25% tariffs on non-USMCA goods were temporarily suspended. Partner tariffs on U.S. exports. 2024. Historically, the U.S. exported goods with relatively lower tariffs, in line with international norms. World Bank, WTO, Pew Research 2016, adjusted. 2025. The retaliatory tariffs from trading partners have significantly increased. Canada, a 25% tariff on $30 billion worth of U.S. goods, as of March 4th, 2025. China, an astronomical 84% tariff on all U.S. goods, which was raised to 125% on April 11th, 2025. Mexico, expected to mirror Canada's tariff levels at 25%, though this is still pending. European Union, planned to impose a 20% tariff on 21 to 22 billion euros worth of U.S. goods, announced April 9, 2025, but this was put on hold for 90 days on April 10, 2025. Other countries. As of now, no major retaliatory tariffs have been confirmed by other nations. Key assumptions. For countries where retaliatory tariffs haven't been fully detailed for 2025, 2024 rates have been carried forward. Trade-weighted averages are implied, but not recalculated, due to the lack of real-time data for 2025. Are these the biggest tariffs ever? As we've seen, by the spring of 2025, the United States unleashed a wave of tariffs that felt less like a well-thought-out economic strategy and more like a bombshell dropped on a global trade. A flat 10% tax now applies to nearly all imports, and in the case of China, the tariffs have escalated to an eye-watering 145%. This naturally raises a crucial question. Are these the highest trade barriers the world has ever seen? To answer that, we need to take a look at history, because history has a way of repeating itself, often with even more dramatic consequences. A glimpse into history. In 1930, during the depths of the Great Depression, the U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which set tariffs on imported goods as high as 59%, pushing the average tariff rate to around 20%. The consequences were swift and severe. Other countries retaliated. Canada raised its tariffs to 30%, and Europe followed suit. The result? World trade collapsed by about 2/3 over the next 4 years. However, even back then, the tariffs were far lower than what we're seeing today with China. Back in 1930, the highest tariff rate was 59%, but today we're looking at 145% on Chinese imports alone. An astonishing leap, especially considering China exported $438.8 billion worth of goods to the U.S. in 2024. But let's go further back in time to see if the world has ever seen tariffs of this magnitude. Looking back even further, Britain's corn laws in the 1800s set grain tariffs between 20% and 50%. While high, these tariffs were narrowly focused on grain, not on vast sectors of the global supply chain. The Morrill Tariff of 1861 in the U.S. set tariffs at about 26%, but again, it targeted specific industries rather than applying sweeping tariffs across the board. So, are these the highest ever? In short, yes. In terms of scope and scale, today's tariffs are uncharted territory. Not only are they high, but they're also widespread, with virtually every trade partner feeling the impact. And unlike past tariff systems, which were often designed based on a reciprocal basis or targeting specific sectors, these tariffs seem to be driven by a trade deficit formula that is often arbitrary and nonsensical. Even as recently as 2020, the global average tariff was only 5.16%, according to the World Bank. A stark contrast to what we're experiencing now. The U.S., which makes up 26% of the world economy, has now completely flipped the script on trade, and based on that, every reasonable person must admit, this is madness. Could this be the beginning of the end? While this move by Trump and his team may have initially seemed like a bold play to restore the U.S.'s trade balance, the reality is far more dire. These actions could easily disrupt the global economy in ways we can't yet fully comprehend. The U.S. and China, two economic giants, are locked in a high-stakes battle, and the ripple effects are already shaking other nations and industries to their core. So, the big question remains, is there even a shred of logic behind these tariffs? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a trade war that could reshape the global economy as we know it? Is there any logic behind Trump's tariffs? Let's be fair and honest from the start. The United States has often drawn the short straw in global trade. But before we dive into the specifics of Trump's tariff wars, let's take a quick look back at history. In the 1800s, Britain's corn laws slapped tariffs of up to 50% on U.S. grain, crippling American farmers, especially those in the Midwest. After World War II, Japan closed its doors while flooding the U.S. market with cars and electronics. By the 1980s, the European community, now the EU, imposed 20% tariffs on U.S. farm exports, even after the U.S. had helped rebuild their cities from the rubble of war. For the most part, the U.S. has kept tariffs relatively low. From 1989 to 2024, U.S. tariffs hovered between 1.5% and 2.5%, largely due to its commitment to free trade agreements like NAFTA/USMCA, KORUS, and a USFTA, as well as its obligations under WTO rules. In contrast, many of the U.S.'s trading partners imposed significantly higher tariffs on American goods during the same period. Developing economies consistently imposed higher tariffs on U.S. products than the U.S. did on theirs. Over time, this growing frustration quietly brewed beneath the surface until 2025, when Donald Trump came in swinging tariffs at everyone like a wrecking ball. His pitch is simple. The world has been cheating the U.S. for decades, and it's time to fight back. But is there any real logic behind his proposed tariffs? Unfortunately, the numbers say no. The reality behind this trade war is uglier than he'll admit. The 145% tariff on China, a shove, not a nudge. Take China's 145% tariff. That's not just retaliation, it's escalation. China sold the U.S. $438.9 billion worth of goods last year. So this isn't a nudge in the right direction. It's a complete shove off a cliff. And for ordinary Americans, this means paying more for everyday goods. That $50 blender from China will now cost over $100. With inflation already at 2.4%, we could see it climb to 4% or higher. But China doesn't just take the hit. In return, they raised tariffs on U.S. goods to 84%, and as of April 11th, it's now 125%. And let's not forget about the European Union. On April 9th, 2025, they announced tariffs on American goods like soybeans, motorcycles, poultry, orange juice, tobacco, steel, aluminum, yachts, and even diamonds. However, just a day later, the EU paused those tariffs for 90 days, perhaps an attempt to dial down the tension. But it's clear that the retaliation cycle is already in full motion. Even South Korea, a long-standing U.S. ally under the KORUS deal, has been hit with a 10% tariff, unraveling decades of goodwill. The real payoff. So what's the payoff supposed to be? Trump's logic is that the U.S. will raise manufacturing jobs at home. But here's the problem. That's not going to happen anytime soon. In the short term, American families, farmers, and small businesses are the ones bearing the brunt of these tariffs, not Beijing or Brussels. Trump's mantra is simple: hurt them until they beg. But history teaches us that such tactics rarely work. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 sparked retaliation from around the globe, collapsing world trade by 66% and deepening the Great Depression. Today's families, farmers, and shop owners are the ones paying for this mistake. The misplaced focus on trade deficits. Here's the kicker. Trump's obsession with the trade deficit, $918 billion in 2024, misses the bigger picture. While trade in goods might be skewed, the U.S. shines in services. In 2023, the U.S. exported $1.02 trillion in services, including software, cloud computing, and intellectual property licensing. This resulted in a services trade surplus of $278 billion. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, Meta, and Alphabet make hundreds of billions overseas, exporting software, technology, and intellectual property. In fact, exports of services in 2024 reached $1.11 trillion, far surpassing imports of $814 billion. So, why focus so much on goods when America's real edge is in code and consulting? A dangerous game. Could services be the next target? Trump's tariff war is effectively punishing imports, mostly of physical goods. But what happens if other countries wake up and start targeting U.S. services? Imagine if nations began banning Microsoft 365, Alphabet services, or even Apple phones, or imposing steep taxes on them. The potential fallout would be massive. Such retaliation wouldn't just hurt goods like steel or soybeans. It would gut America's tech sector. If countries impose taxes or bans on U.S. services, we're talking about hundreds of billions in U.S. exports wiped out. The result? Thousands of tech jobs lost, stock prices tanking, and a ripple effect across the economy. In this scenario, the US would be on the receiving end of a digital dagger, the kind of retaliation that's a lot harder to recover from. But it seems Trump's team hasn't thought this through. They're stuck in a 1950s mindset focused on physical goods, while the world's economy runs on apps and data. The real cost: American families and small businesses. At the end of the day, the biggest losers in this trade war are American families, small businesses, and farmers. While the rhetoric sounds tough and the tariffs may feel like bold action, it's the everyday American who pays the price when the dust settles. So, here's where we need to focus. The real people who are being left to foot the bill. Consumers and small businesses face the worst impact. The 2025 tariff storm is no longer a distant threat. It's here, and unfortunately, it's hitting American consumers and small business owners the hardest. This is a perfect example of just how miscalculated and damaging Trump's trade war really is. A heavy price for consumers. For everyday Americans, the numbers are nothing short of shocking. Consider this. A pair of Nike shoes, typically priced at $100 and made in China, now faces a 145% tariff, driving the price to $245. A $500 smartphone from China? That price skyrockets to $1,225. These are staggering price increases, more than double what consumers are used to paying. And perhaps the most unbelievable part, this is actually happening, and Americans are the ones left holding the bag. The hope that these new U.S. factories will help balance the scales is, frankly, unrealistic. Building new factories takes years, and the reality is that most American workers aren't eager to trade in their higher-paying jobs for the often low wages that factory work offers. In 2024, manufacturing jobs made up only 8.8% of the U.S. workforce. People aren't rushing to fill low-wage positions. So, whether or not new factories get built, the burden of these higher prices will fall directly on the shoulders of American consumers. But the impact of these tariffs goes much deeper than just the higher costs of everyday goods. Critical supplies at risk. The U.S. depends on China for critical supplies that impact public health. For instance, around 80% of the raw materials needed to produce antibiotics, a cornerstone of modern medicine, come from China. This dependence leaves America vulnerable to disruptions. If tariffs lead to higher costs or supply shortages, it could have devastating effects on public health. The result could be higher healthcare costs, limited access to essential medications, and a real risk to the health of millions of Americans. Given the already rising costs of healthcare, this is a ticking time bomb for the nation. Small business owners are taking the brunt. Small business owners are also in a nightmare scenario. Their supply chains are in chaos, and many are struggling to even keep their doors open. Here are just a few examples from real businesses and real people already feeling the pain. Casey Ames, a small business owner, vented his frustrations on X. His order, originally set to cost $4,707 in tariffs for 2024, will now balloon to $101,673 due to the Liberation Day tariffs. How is anyone supposed to plan for this? He asks, pointing out that the tariffs hit before he can even sell his products. I'm paying the U.S. government $100,000 even before I have a chance to sell my inventory. Another small business owner posted on Reddit about a $3,380 order of Chinese aluminum parts, which saw a 73% tariff, a whopping $2,483.21, on March 31st, 2025. DHL gave him an ultimatum: pay now or the parts get sent back in 5 days. One more owner, who runs a bamboo clothing and bedding shop, posted, with a 54% tariff on bamboo, I may have to shut down. I just hit my 10,000th order last week, and now it feels like all my hard work is being ripped out from under me. Even Mr. Beast, the popular YouTuber, chimed in on X, saying, ironically, because of all the new tariffs, it's now cheaper to make our chocolate bars globally, not in America, because other countries don't have a 20% plus tariff on our goods. The true cost to small business owners. With 60% of small businesses operating on profit margins of under 5%, many simply can't absorb these massive tariff costs. The painful choice for many business owners is clear: raise prices and risk losing customers, or shut down altogether. In this tariff storm, small businesses and consumers are left in a vicious cycle where planning has become a luxury they can't afford. How do you plan for anything when the tariff model changes almost daily, or sometimes multiple times a day? This isn't a normal business environment. It's chaotic, unpredictable, and unsustainable. The bigger question. So, the question remains, why is this happening? Why are American families, small businesses, and workers being asked to bear the weight of these tariffs? The truth is, the cost of this trade war is far greater than what Trump's administration is willing to admit. It's not just about higher prices. It's about undermining the very fabric of the American economy and leaving everyday citizens to foot the bill. If this continues, we may be looking at a crippling impact that lasts long after the tariffs are lifted. Consumers and small businesses will continue to struggle under the weight of these poorly designed policies, and the ripple effects will be felt across the country for years to come. So who are the winners and losers in this trade war? It's no surprise that public frustration is boiling over as this trade war drags on. But the real question is, who's benefiting from this economic chaos? The short answer, almost no one, unless a fair agreement is reached soon. While a handful of individuals or companies may see modest gains, the vast majority are staring down the barrel of a slow-motion economic train wreck. Who wins? Let's start with a few who might scrape by with marginal wins. A handful of U.S. manufacturers, such as steel plants in Ohio or Pennsylvania, might see a temporary boost. With tariffs set at 10% across the board and a staggering 145% on Chinese imports, foreign competition is certainly getting throttled. This could lead to a brief uptick in orders and potentially a few hundred new jobs. But don't expect this to spark a manufacturing renaissance. We've seen this before. When Trump tried a similar move in 2018, steel prices spiked, but hiring barely budged. It was a narrow win, lost in a sea of red ink. A few foreign players might also benefit. For example, Brazil could see a rise in soybean exports to China, now that U.S. farmers are sidelined by Canada's retaliatory 25% tariffs. India might export more textiles and pharmaceuticals as Chinese goods are priced out. Singapore, shielded by old trade agreements, might see a bump in port traffic. But let's be clear, these are scavenged opportunities, small wins amid a global economic breakdown. Who loses? The losers? Well, they're everywhere. American consumers are paying much higher prices for everyday goods. Small businesses are watching their supply chains fall apart and are being forced to either raise prices or shut down. Farmers are stuck with higher costs and fewer exports, especially as retaliatory tariffs hit crops like soybeans and poultry. Entire industries, from tech to retail, are dealing with broken supply chains and inflated prices. So who's really winning here? A couple of domestic steel executives may see their profits rise, but for everyone else, it's a losing game. Oh, and let's not forget about the Trump family. They're likely shorting or longing the market based on whatever announcement comes next, making a profit on the volatility they've created. Trump's gamble, a recipe for economic chaos. This isn't a strategy, it's economic self-sabotage disguised as strength. Trump's tariff gamble isn't bringing prosperity. It's fueling inflation, disrupting supply chains, and pushing small businesses to the brink. The chaos is real, and the costs are only rising. But there's still a glimmer of hope. If a good trade agreement can be reached with most countries, and quickly, we might be able to stem the damage. What's next? Where's this heading? So what has all this led? Is there an end in sight? And what could possible scenarios look like? If Trump's tariffs remain in place or escalate, the U.S. economy could face long-term repercussions, from higher consumer prices to a full-scale recession. If a trade agreement is reached soon, there could be a recovery, though it would take years for businesses to regain stability and for the damage to be undone. Alternatively, if the global trade system continues to break down, we might see a fragmented world economy, where countries turn inward and protectionism becomes the norm. No matter the scenario, everyone, from everyday consumers to entire industries, will will continue to feel the consequences of this ongoing trade war. The question is, how long can this chaos continue before it all unravels? Tariffs, scenarios for 2025 and beyond. The damage has been done, and as the smoke rises, one question remains. Will we see a new world order, or just a bigger mess? The future is hanging by a thread, with several possible scenarios ahead. Of course, no one can predict the future, but let's break down a few possibilities. Scenario 1. All countries agree and we get a fair trade system. This would be the best-case scenario for everyone involved. Imagine a rare moment where the world comes together in unity. It's mid-2025, and Trump's tariff storm miraculously leads to a global fair trade pact that stitches most of the pieces back into place. In this scenario, tariffs drop to a modest 5%, and global trade begins to thrive again. A wave of prosperity would shine in everyone's eyes. This is the hope most people are holding on to. So, what would need to happen for this to become a reality? How could this happen? The EU, suffering from billions in lost exports to the US, might organize a major meeting in Brussels. China, hit hard by the 145% tariffs on its goods, could reluctantly send negotiators to the table. Canada and Mexico, leveraging the USMCA, could push the deal forward. By July 2025, most countries might sign on, leading to a trade and market boom. This is the best option, and if it happens, the sooner, the better. However, I'd give this scenario a 20% chance of happening. Scenario 2. USA and China trade war continues. US partners with India, and China finds new allies. In this scenario, the US-China trade war drags on, but the US turns to India as its new manufacturing hub, while China scrambles to find new trade partners. By late 2025, Trump's tariffs could solidify a tectonic shift, with India stepping in to replace China as the world's factory and China forming new trade blocs to survive. How could this happen? The US, with its 145% tariffs on $438 billion of Chinese exports, could strike a deal with India, which already lowered tariffs on US goods like bourbon and motorcycles in early 2025. Prime Minister Modi, eager to boost India's $89 billion export to the US, might fast-track a pact to shift 60% of US manufacturing from China to India's factories in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat. Meanwhile, China, facing a huge loss of exports, could turn to Russia, Brazil, and Southeast Asia, forming a rival trade network. Consequences: U.S. imports from China drop by 50%, while India's exports to the U.S. surge by 40%. U.S. manufacturing jobs rise modestly by 500,000, but costs climb due to India's lagging infrastructure. China's new trade bloc boosts its exports to Brazil by 20% and Russia by 15%, softening the impact. Subscenario A. U.S. firms like Apple and Nike double India's output, with iPhone production hitting 30% of global supply. However, bottlenecks in India's ports and power grid delay deliveries, raising costs by 10%. U.S. rural factories lose 100,000 jobs as manufacturing shifts overseas again. Subscenario B. China floods Southeast Asia with cheap goods, causing Vietnam's exports to the U.S. to fall by 15%, triggering a regional price war. This scenario feels like a 25% chance. Trump's meeting with Modi in February suggests a strategic pivot, but China is far from out. It's still a formidable player with a knack for making new friends. Scenario 3. Currency wars break out. What if currency becomes the new battleground? By mid-2025, Trump's tariffs could set off a wave of currency devaluations, turning money itself into the weapon. How could this happen? China might devalue the yuan by 25% to mitigate the impact of the 145% tariffs. The EU could devalue the euro by 20% to dodge US duties. Japan might trim the yen by 15% to boost its exports. The US, in desperation, could weaken the dollar by 12%. As countries race to devalue their currencies, global trade would spiral into chaos. Consequences: U.S. inflation spikes to 9% by 2026, pushing the price of a $2,000 TV to $2,600. Global trade drops by 30%. Small businesses collapse, 25% shut down, and 7 million jobs are lost. Gold hits $4,000 an ounce. Sub-scenario A. Bitcoin surges to $250,000 as people flock to digital currencies. Unfortunately, average people lose 30% of their savings. This scenario is a nightmare, but there's a 15% chance it could happen. Scenario 4. Partial trade deal. What if the world settles for a half deal? By 2026, Trump's tariffs could force a shaky partial trade accord, where some countries reach agreements, but many issues remain unresolved. How could this happen? The EU might agree to a 10% tariff cap. China could agree to 50% tariffs. Canada and Mexico might hold at 15% retaliation, adjusting the USMCA. In this scenario, global trade grows 5%, U.S. jobs rise modestly by 200,000, and prices drop slightly. A $100 blender now costs $80. The trade deficit shrinks by 10%, and the stock market recovers slightly, with GDP growth at 1.5%. This scenario is likely to happen with a 30% chance. Scenario 5. Transition to an AI and robot economy. This is the future scenario. By 2030, Trump's tariffs and other factors could push major powers like the US, China, and the EU into a world where AI and robots produce everything, from cars to cornflakes. Jobs disappear, wealth shifts, and governments scramble to maintain stability with Universal Basic Income, UBI. How could this happen? The US might invest $700 billion in automation, 2025 to 2028 budgets, relying on robots to avoid tariffs and rebuild the economy. China, already using robots in 50% of its factories, could increase this to 90% by 2030, aiming for complete self-sufficiency. The EU and Japan would invest heavily in automation to stay competitive. By 2030, factories could be mostly automated, and tariffs may no longer matter as nations depend on machines. Consequences: global trade drops by 60%. U.S. manufacturing jobs fall by 40% as robots take over. Wages decrease by 15%, and the median income drops to $50,000. Prices stay stable, but wealth becomes even more concentrated. UBI might be introduced, providing $1,000 a month per adult, funded by taxes on tech giants like Amazon, Apple, and Google. Subscenario: AI leads to a tech war. US and China hack each other's power grids, causing $1 trillion in damage. Tech stocks like Tesla surge 50%, reaching a $2 trillion valuation. The UBI debate rages on in Congress, with half calling for $2,000 a month and others decrying it as socialism, delaying the rollout. This scenario might sound like science fiction, but it could be a reality by 2030. Let's give it a 10% chance, though it could be much higher as AI, quantum computing, and robotics advance at an unprecedented pace. Final thought. So where do we stand? Honestly, I'm not sure. No one can say with certainty what's going to happen. The truth is, no one knows what Trump or Xi Jinping might decide tomorrow. Heck, even they probably don't know their next move, despite all the talk about playing 3D, 4D, or even 8D chess. The reality is, trade doesn't work because it's flawless. It works because, for better or worse, it's the least broken system we have in place. If we break it completely, we won't just go back to the past. We'll slide sideways into something unrecognizable. Let's hope we don't go down that path. Let's hope that in the end, all of this chaos leads to something better, a better world, especially for the middle and lower classes. Yes, it sounds like a utopia, but maybe humanity is finally ready for something better, something more just and sustainable. It's a shame that 8.2 billion of us rely on the decisions of a few. But maybe, just maybe, one day AI will step in to play a fairer game than any politician or leader has ever managed to do. A game that's genuinely sustainable for the coming decades, centuries, and millennia.